Welcome back to eGet Mac. We're going to continue to learn about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so here we're going to incorporate to the model that we've been talking about so far, the concepts of unemployment, inflation, and be able to analyze what type of policy we'd want to implement, at least get an idea based on those measurements, those economic measurements, okay, which will be related to economic growth, since on the x-axis of this model, we have real GDP. Okay, so it's a really, really useful model, once again, to understand how a shock translates in terms of economic activity, in terms of how does it impact inflation, unemployment, production. Okay, so that's the idea. So it's a very flexible model and very used for economic analysis. Okay, so just a quick recap before I move forward. You feel free to pause the video if you want, but I'm just going to kind of flow through this one, especially because the definitions question. Okay, just want to make sure that we're on the same page. From now on, when we talk about full employment GDP, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we're talking about potential GDP. We talk about when the natural rate of unemployment equals the unemployment rate. So the most efficient labor market outcome given the current scenario of the economy. Okay, we're gonna talk more about this to make sure we understand what we mean about the current scenario, what type of unemployment rates are we talking about. Okay, and when GDP gap is zero, that's also correct as well, right? If you remember, the GDP gap is the distance, the gap between the current level of production in the economy and the potential GDP, or full employment GDP, as we know here. Okay, so in this case, B, C, and D would be correct. All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions about that interpretation. This should be a review based on what we saw so far in this semester. Okay, so let's kind of refresh on that though, in case that wasn't a review. If you remember, when we talk about the unemployment rate, we talk about different types of unemployment. So we decompose them into short-run unemployment and long-run unemployment, right? The short run is the one that bounces around because of short-run moves in GDP. So recessions, expansions, the business cycles that we tend to see, that we have talked about, right? But there's also structural and friction unemployment, which I have discussed. Those are long-term, right? Those are tend to be always there and leads the unemployment rate to not be 0% ever, right? That's why the most efficient level, given the current economy condition, is always around between 3 and 4%, 3.5%. Okay, that's where we want to be. Okay. And if you don't remember the difference between those two types of unemployment, feel free to shoot me an email and we can dive into those more into the virtual class. Okay. So for the baseline here, we're going to talk about, when we talk about the net rate of unemployment, don't forget that it includes both frictional and structural unemployment. Okay. And just refining here one more time, when we talk about U star, the net rate of unemployment, that means GDP equals potential GDP, just like we just discussed. So how does that can be analyzed in a graph? Okay. Just pretty much interpreting in a different way the graphs that I've seen so far. And we've already started doing this. This kind of just repeating one more time how important it is, the graphical analysis, and actually understanding what can we derive from these graphics, okay? So for example, in this case, we're looking to high unemployment case. Okay, so like I said, high unemployment would be that we're far away from the potential GDP line from where we want to be. Given the current situation. Okay, so in this case, you can see that we're E1, that's the current production level of the economy, the current GDP, real GDP, right? And you can see that there is a GDP gap, right? The GDP gap is not zero, it's actually negative. So that's important. It's not that only different than zero, it's negative. It's behind. We're behind where we wanted to be. Okay, in that case, we know that there's more people unemployed than if we're actually at the potential GDP line at that point. Okay, because there's resources that are not being used, and that's why we can produce that much, right? So that's the idea of how we can recognize high employment to this graph, right? The opposite then would be, if we get where we want to be, then once again, that means that we are where the potential GDP line is as well. That's when GDP gap is zero, right? The unemployment rate equals the net rate of unemployment, which means we still have frictional and structural unemployment, but cyclical unemployment is zero. Okay, so that's the goal here. And there's also the case where we could be overproducing, right? We have talked about situations like that in our class, such as the housing bubble of 2007, the dot-com bubble, right? Those are all periods that people are overproducing at that moment, maybe because they cannot correctly or properly evaluate the riskness of their investments. There's this expectation, this high optimism that investments are going to turn around to be great, right? So it's that bubble formation that we talked about, okay? So in this case, we're also going to be known as the tight labor market. So whenever there's loose labor market, there's a lot of unemployment. And here's the opposite, tight labor market. That means that it's really hard to get more workers, right? In this case, you can think we're producing at E1, and that's actually past what we want to produce, what we want to be at, right? And if that's the case, then we know that's not sustainable in the long run. Now, Eddie, is that true? Is that actually happen in reality? Is overproduction means that we are producing too much? Is there a thing? Wouldn't we just grow more? Well, this is kind of a recap because we talked about this, but I think it's important to dive into it again because it shows us the relevance of understanding where the economy stands, right? So in this case, you can see here that the gray areas of these graphs, as you can see here, those are recessions, okay? And as you can imagine, what we're seeing here, the blue is the net rate of unemployment. So this accounts for still the presence of frictional and structural unemployment, right? And the red one is actually the actual rate of unemployment. So this one also accounts for cyclical unemployment that we're experiencing, okay? And you can see here that usually before each recession hits, we tend to have the natural rate of unemployment being higher than the current unemployment rate. In other words, the current unemployment rate is lower than what we want it to be. And if we're overproducing, we eventually have to pay back that overproduction, that decision to consume more now than in the future, right? Because it's not efficient right now. So we have to eventually bounce back. And that's the business cycles that we've been talking about so far. And you can see that that's the case before recessions, right? Just like we just saw that we're indicated that we're heading to one. Now the pandemic hit, was that we expected? No, but it raises some questions. Were we heading to a recession anyway? The economy is always changing, like we talk about, right? And if the economy is always changing, maybe now the same things that led to recessions don't lead to recessions anymore because the economy has evolved. But we have learned from the past that those are important parameters to pay attention to because they can lead to the same outcome as before if the economy has not evolved as much. This is the importance of research, using past information to better understand what's going on right now and then make a better plan of action. Okay. So that's the idea here. So let's kind of put it all together and interpret that. How can I put those kind of concepts together in a question that really, really points out whether you're understanding what we're talking about so far? Okay. So an aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram. So the graphs that we saw so far of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Okay. Blank could explain a rise in cyclical unemployment. So which one of the following scenarios, A, B, C, or D, can explain the rise in cyclical unemployment based on what we talked about so far? Okay. So take a minute and try to answer. And hopefully you can get the correct answer, but we're going to discuss it in a second. We can always dive into it more in the virtual class. Okay, welcome back, and hopefully you got a good try of this exercise. And it's actually a really good exercise to think about the dynamics of this model, right? So let's try to solve it together here, and let's start with A, right? So the first thing I need you to notice is, hey, what is each alternative telling me? Is it an increase or a decrease? What is this curve? Which curve is shifting and in which direction? Okay, so as you can see, I already draw the graph for us here so we can save some time on the video. And we're pretty much analyzing which direction, which curve. Okay, so it shifts in the long run aggregate supply. Instead of starting with, wait, let's just talk about each curve. That's better. Instead of solving the exercise, let's learn the concept itself through the exercise. Okay, so the long run aggregate supply shifts in that. We know that that's related to long run unemployment, right? So it's not going to be the focus of this question since we're talking about cyclical unemployment, right? Now, okay, what about the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply? Okay, those are different stories. We know that moving those, because we already talked about them throughout this chapter, will move the equilibrium past or lead it to lag behind the potential GDP line, right? So we want to recognize now which type of movement in those curves will lead to higher unemployment, which we know that those are movements of the short run, right? Since we'll be translated then into the cyclical unemployment changes. Okay, so if we're looking, basically we're looking now into the short run supply and the aggregate demand, right? If we're looking at shifting them to the right, we know there'll be an increase in those curves. And if there's an increase in those curves, they're going to shift this way. If they're shifting to the right and they're shifting, leading the economy to be past the potential GDP line, and you can try those on your own and see whether they're not going to work or not. I really, really advise you guys to try. So that's a great way to see if you're understanding how to do those shifts, okay? That would lead us to have actually a positive GDP gap. And if we're trying to consume more, if we're trying to produce more, we're going to need more workers. So obviously, it starts to be easier to see that the unemployment rate would not increase. It would actually go down, given that we are getting to those higher level of production. Okay, but the question becomes, what about when we think about them shifting to the left? Okay, in other words, decreasing. And that's a really good one to think about it too, okay? And let me shift those in the graph. So if we're shifting them to the left, I can simply shift the curves here. And we're meaning that we are demanding less goods and services. And hey, look what I figured out here. There's a negative GDP gap that is arising there, okay? So in this case, yeah, it seems like the cyclical unemployment is going up, okay? I'm gonna shift colors here just so I don't have to delete and write everything again. Now, what about the short-run aggregate supply? What if we shift that to the left once again, doing the same thing, decreasing that curve? Okay, in that case, we know that we would be crossing with the old aggregate demand because we're shifting one at a time. Okay, and once again, we also notice here a GDP gap. Okay, that is negative. Okay, so we're starting to see, and we can get to the conclusion then that the correct answer is A. Okay, so let me know if you guys have any questions. That's a really good exercise to see if you're understanding the material. Okay, moving forward, I also want to talk about the inflationary pressure and how this applies to this model. Okay, so usually take this with a grain of salt because, like I said, the economy is also changing. It depends on what's going on, what shock the economy suffered. But usually, you can think about we tend to have higher levels of inflation during or just past economic expansions and booms. So when the country is growing really fast. Okay. Now we tend to have lower levels of inflation when people stop consuming and stop producing so much. So during recessionary periods. Okay. And here's a couple of examples. Is in 1991 and 92. During a recession, the inflation fell from 5.4 to 3%. And in the last one in 2007 that we've been talking about so far, well, last one, I guess this is the last one, but we're not past it yet. So in 2007, the most recent completed recession led to actual deflation. Okay, so you can see that, and you can see that on the graph as well, right? We tend to see that despite not being very predominant in terms of the range of where the inflation rate is, you can see that looking at the movement itself, we can see that whenever we hit a recession, we tend to see drops after that, right? As you can see here, okay? At the same time, though, we tend to see inflation moving up, leading to recessions most of the time, right? So you can see that leading to a recession, we see the inflation rates going up. Not all the time. You can see some cases a little bit more troubling to see. And that's why it's important to say that this is a tendency. This is not a rule, okay? But good to think about. So high inflation, are we growing too fast? Something to think about. Okay, but what types of inflation can arise in this case? Two types we're going to talk about. Demand push inflation and cost pull inflation. So it's going to be one based on the aggregate demand and one based on the aggregate supply. Okay, the short run aggregate supply. So in the aggregate demand here, we're going to talk about during economic booms, business and consumers get really confident, right? Oh my God, the stock market is booming. I believe that the economy is doing really well. Even though we talked about the stock market not being a perfect picture of the economy, they are correlated, right? So let's say you look into that news and you get super excited and you go and, hey, I'm going to invest in buying that house. It looks like it's a good time to do that. Business, I'm optimistic about my business, my work, right? And that's what we call the demand push inflation, that constant increase in aggregate demand. Okay, and I'm gonna have graphs to show that, which is right now. Okay, so in this case, you can see, given that there's a demand push inflation, that means that the aggregate demand keeps pushing for higher levels of consumption, which you can see here moves us from E1 to potentially E2 in this case. And you can see here the large movement in the price level, okay, causing the inflation through changes in the aggregate demand. Okay. The second one is the cost pull inflation. So this is led by the supply side, right? So for example, rising input prices. So if energy prices and gas and all those things start to go up a lot, right, or even other raw materials, then now the cost of production goes up. If the cost of production goes up and the final price of those goods and services doesn't change right away, right, then we know the marginal profit's going down. Suppliers have an incentive to supply less, and we know that's going to shift the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, to the left, right? Causing then the prices to also go up. So we can see how through two different channels the inflation could arise. Okay, so in this case here, you can think we're at E1, and given that input prices go up, we know that the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. That shift is not permanent, so we would only shift the short-run aggregate supply and not the long-run aggregate supply, right, as we talked about before. In this case, you can see here that it's leading to higher levels of inflation as well. Okay, a big difference here, however, is that you can see that on the demand pull inflation, oh, sorry about that, I just want to point out something, output increased though, so during a period of growth. But when we look into the demand cost pull inflation, actually production went down. Okay, so if you remember, we talked about this being the case of stagflation. Okay, a moment where the economy experienced both high inflation and high unemployment. Because you can see here the GDP gap increased and prices went up as well. Okay, so this is kind of how we do the analysis with all of this. Now, moving forward, I'm going to have putting it all together and closing up. We're going to show how this model can be applied to a situation that happened in the past in the 90-91 recession. And then we're going to close by talk about the Keynesian and neoclassical view. Okay, keep tuned, and I'll be back with more videos.